Listen closely. A dropped fork. A heavy silence. That's all it took to pivot Rose's life from a minimum wage grind into the crosshairs of the city's most lethal predator. She didn't mean to impress a syndicate boss. She just wanted his mother to stop yelling about the soup. Porcelain clattered against the stainless steel dish pit, a jarring, brittle sound that made Rose wince. Her lower back throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache pulsing in time with the faint bass leaking from the kitchen's cheap radio. She wiped her damp hands on her apron, leaving a streak of dark grease across the white canvas. It was hour 10 of a double shift at Le Petit Oiseau, a high-end trap for people with too much money and too little palate. The air in the back was thick and suffocating, smelling heavily of scorched butter, chemical bleach, and the metallic tang of anxiety sweat. Rose leaned against the prep counter, staring blindly at the ticket machine. She was exhausted down to her marrow. Her cheap orthotics had given up 3 hours ago, leaving the arches of her feet to bear the brunt of the hard, greasy tile. She pinned a stray coil of dark hair back behind her ear, the harsh kitchen bulbs reflecting off the sweat on her dark skin. She just needed 2 more hours. 2 hours, and she could go home to her cramped apartment, drink a glass of tap water, and pass out. The swinging doors kicked open. Colin, the floor captain, pushed through, his face the colour of old oatmeal. He practically collapsed against the pastry station, clutching a pristine linen napkin to his chest, as if it could stop his heart from pounding out of his ribcage. "Table 6, he gasped, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Haze is here." Rose didn't care about a haze. She cared about the blister forming on her left heel. She grabbed a pitcher of ice water, the condensation dripping over her knuckles. "Who is Hayes?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of the panic currently infecting the rest of the kitchen staff. "Victor Hayes," Colin hissed, adjusting his bow tie with shaking fingers. "He runs the port. He runs the import unions. He runs half the shell companies in this zip code. He's the head of the sole syndicate, Rose, and he brought his mother." Victor Hayes was an open secret in the city, a man with a perfectly tailored, boardroom-ready Western name who sat at the head of a sprawling, vicious criminal enterprise. The evening news called him a logistics magnate. The streets called him a butcher. Rose just called him another arrogant rich guy who was going to tip poorly if his steak wasn't cooked exactly to a medium-rare 135 degrees. She pushed through the swinging doors, carrying a tray of sliced baguette, and felt the atmospheric shift immediately. The dining room of Le Petit Oiseau was usually a hum of pretentious chatter and clinking crystal. Tonight, the air felt thin. The ambient jazz music seemed entirely too loud because the surrounding conversation had dropped to a fearful murmur. Rose saw him immediately. He wasn't a hulking mountain of muscle, nor did he have a cartoonish scar across his face. He sat at the corner VIP booth, perfectly still, radiating a quiet, suffocating gravity that seemed to bend the room around him. He wore a charcoal suit cut so perfectly it looked poured over his shoulders, the dark wool absorbing the dim, amber lighting of the restaurant. His dark hair was meticulously parted, but it was his eyes that caught her. They were flat, dead. They tracked the movement of the waiters with the mechanical precision of a security camera. He smelled faintly, even from a distance, of ozone and expensive vetiver. Across from him sat an older woman, Mary Hayes, according to the reservation notes. She looked tiny in the oversized leather booth, wrapped tightly in a silver cashmere shawl that likely cost more than Rose's car. Her posture was rigidly straight, her thin hands adorned with heavy jade rings. Her mouth was set in a permanent, deep line of dissatisfaction. Rose watched from the server station as Colin approached the table. He carried himself like a lamb walking to an altar, presenting the evening's amuse-bouche, a delicate, ridiculous foam of something Rose couldn't pronounce, sitting on a single ceramic spoon. Mary didn't look at Colin. She looked at the spoon, then looked up at her son. She began to speak. It wasn't English. It was Korean. It was spoken with a sharp, heavy regional dialect that instantly bypassed the stifling French restaurant and transported Rose straight back to the 3 years she spent shivering in a poorly insulated apartment in Busan. It brought back the smell of street-side tteokbokki, the crushing weight of her student debt, and the endless hours she spent teaching English verbs to exhausted, uniformed teenagers. "This is air," the older woman complained in her native tongue, her voice rasping like dry leaves against pavement. "I am hungry, Victor. You bring me to a place that serves flavored air." Victor sighed, a barely perceptible drop of his broad shoulders. "Mother, it's a delicacy. Eat it. We will get real food after," he replied in English. His tone was clipped, tired, the voice of a man who commanded hundreds of violent men but couldn't control a 70-year-old woman. "I don't want it," she snapped back in Korean, waving a hand dismissively. "And this boy smells like sour milk." She gestured vaguely at Colin, who smiled nervously, completely oblivious to the insult. Colin, sweating profusely now, leaned in closer. "Is everything to your liking, ma'am?" "Get him away from me," Mary said, switching to heavily accented broken English, her face twisting in disgust. "Smells bad." Colin froze, his polite customer service smile fracturing into a look of pure terror. He looked at Victor for help, silently pleading. But Victor simply picked up his crystal water glass, offering nothing. The cruelty in his indifference made Rose's jaw tighten. She hated this. She hated the uneven power dynamic, the humiliation of a working-class waiter, the sheer, stubborn inefficiency of a miscommunication dragging on because a man with too much ego refused to translate for his mother. Rose's fingers dug into the hard plastic edge of her serving tray. Her internal alarm bells were screaming at her. Walk away. Keep your head down. Pay your rent. Do not engage with the man who allegedly put a rival distributor in a concrete drum last Tuesday. But Mary was rubbing her temples now, looking genuinely distressed, isolated, and entirely tired of a world that didn't bother to understand her. And Rose, despite her bitter cynicism, despite the burning ache in her feet and the exhaustion dragging at her bones, felt a sharp twist of empathy. She knew what it was like to be a foreigner in a room full of people staring at you. She hated seeing an elder look so profoundly unseen. Rose stepped forward before her brain could veto the movement. Her heavy black work shoes squeaked faintly against the polished hardwood floor, a sound that seemed deafening in the tense quiet of the corner. She approached the booth, cutting off Colin just as he opened his mouth to stammer another useless, trembling apology. "Let me take that, Colin," she murmured, smoothly sliding the untouched amuse-bouche off the table and onto her tray. She didn't look at Victor. Instead, she kept her eyes respectfully lowered, focusing entirely on the intricate silver embroidery of Mary's shawl. Then she opened her mouth. "Halmione," Rose said softly. "Grandmother." The honorific slipped out naturally, rolling off her tongue and grounding the chaotic moment. "I apologize. The food here is very rich, very heavy. It isn't good for a tired stomach." She spoke in fluid Korean, her accent carrying the faint, unmistakable lilt of the southern provinces where she had lived. The silence that crashed over the table wasn't just heavy, it was absolute. The ambient clinking of silverware from the surrounding tables seemed to vanish, sucked out of the air by the vacuum of Victor Hayes's sudden, undivided attention. Mary blinked, her dark eyes widening in her wrinkled face. She stared at Rose. She saw a tall, exhausted black woman with an apron stained with tomato reduction, standing in a pretentious French restaurant, speaking to her with the exact cadence and deference of a dutiful daughter in the old country. "You speak our language?" Mary asked. Her voice instantly lost its sharp, combative edge, replaced by a tentative, fragile curiosity. "A little," Rose replied in Korean, keeping her tone even, desperately ignoring the way her pulse was suddenly hammering against the base of her throat. The back of her neck prickled violently. She could feel Victor looking at her. It wasn't a casual glance, it was a dissection. "I lived in Busan for 3 years. The grandmothers in my neighborhood fed me when I was too broke to buy groceries. I know what good food tastes like. And this," she gestured to the foam on the plate, "is just flavored air, you were right." A short, sudden laugh barked out of Mary's chest. It was a genuine, surprised sound of delight. Her rigid shoulders dropped. The deep tension in her jaw dissolved. "You have sense," Mary said, nodding approvingly. She pointed a gnarled, jade-heavy finger at Rose. "You tell the chef I want something warm. Broth, no cream, no butter, just broth and rice. They don't have rice back there, Halmione," Rose said gently, allowing a small, tired smile to touch the corners of her mouth. "But I have some plain chicken stock we use as a base. I can put some fresh ginger and green onions in it. It will warm your stomach." Mary beamed, looking completely transformed. "Yes, good girl. Go." Rose took a shallow breath. She finally dared to shift her gaze. She looked up, expecting to meet Victor's eyes, just to offer a polite nod before retreating to the safety of the kitchen. It was a catastrophic mistake. Victor Hayes wasn't just looking at her. He was leaning forward, his thick forearms resting on the white linen tablecloth. His eyes weren't dead anymore. They were entirely awake, focused, burning with a strange, dark intensity that made Rose's breath catch in her lungs. Up close, the scent of his cologne was overpowering, mixing with the primal smell of danger. She noticed a faint, jagged white scar ticking at the very edge of his sharp jawline. He didn't look grateful that she had appeased his mother. He looked like a predator who had just found a completely new species of prey and had already calculated exactly how to trap it. Rose's stomach dropped. The air in her lungs turned to lead. She wanted to step back, to break the magnetic, suffocating eye contact, but she felt physically pinned to the floorboards. Her raw instinct screamed at her to run. She had stepped out of line. She had made herself visible. In her attempt to be kind, she had stepped directly into a snare. Victor slowly tilted his head, his gaze dropping from her eyes to the cheap plastic name tag pinned crookedly to her apron. "Rose," he said. His voice was a low rumble, quieter than she expected, but it carried a physical weight that vibrated right through her ribs. He didn't have an accent. He sounded perfectly American. He sounded like old money, tailored suits, and cold-blooded violence. "Sir," she managed to reply. She kept her voice entirely devoid of emotion, a desperate shield against his scrutiny. She gripped her serving tray so hard, her knuckles turned a greyish white, the edges biting painfully into her palms. Victor leaned back slightly against the leather booth, his eyes never leaving her face. He studied her. He took in the tired circles under her dark eyes, the defiant set of her jaw, the defensive, rigid way she held her shoulders. He saw right through the polite waitress facade, down to the cynical, exhausted, beautifully complex woman underneath. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a register meant only for her. "You just stole my heart." It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't a romantic declaration accompanied by sweeping violins and soft lighting. He said it the way a king claims a new territory. It was a quiet, terrifying statement of fact. It was an absolute claim of ownership. Rose felt a cold sweat break out along her spine. She didn't blush. Her heart didn't flutter. She felt a surge of profound, bitter irritation, violently mixed with cold terror. Of course, she thought. Of course, the one time I try to do something nice, to alleviate an old woman's discomfort, I end up drawing the eye of a psychopath. "I'll get that broth for your mother," Rose said flatly. She completely ignored his comment. She spun on her heel, her sneakers squeaking loudly against the wood, and walked swiftly back toward the kitchen doors. She kept her spine perfectly straight, fighting the urge to look back, feeling the heavy, suffocating heat of Victor Hayes's stare boring into her back with every single step she took. Rain slicked the asphalt of the alleyway, turning the greasy puddles behind Le Petit Oiseau into dark, fractured mirrors. Rose pushed the heavy steel exit door open, the hinges screaming a metallic protest into the 2 a.m. silence. The damp chill of the night air hit her flushed face, smelling strongly of wet garbage and diesel exhaust from the idling delivery trucks 2 streets over. She pulled her thin denim jacket tighter across her chest. The adrenaline that had kept her upright through the dinner rush was completely gone, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. Every muscle in her legs twitched. Her jaw ached from clenching it for the last 4 hours. She had avoided the main dining room for the rest of her shift. She had traded sections with a busboy, hiding in the humid, chaotic depths of the dish pit, scrubbing cast-iron pans until her knuckles bled, just to stay out of sight. It hadn't stopped the crawling sensation at the nape of her neck. The feeling of being watched had settled into her skin like a parasite. Rose kept her head down, walking the 4 blocks to the bus stop, with her keys threaded tightly between her knuckles. It was a paranoid habit, but tonight, the shadows stretching across the cracked pavement felt heavier, thicker. A black sedan idled at the corner of 5th and Moyenne. Its engine purred with a low, expensive hum. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside. Rose's breath caught against her ribs. She didn't speed up. She didn't run. Running invited a chase. She just kept her steady, aching pace, forcing her eyes forward until she boarded the glaringly bright, empty transit bus. She didn't sleep. She lay on her lumpy mattress in her cramped 4th-floor walk-up, staring at the water stain on the ceiling. The radiator banged against the wall, a rhythmic metallic clanking that usually lulled her into unconsciousness. Tonight it sounded like a countdown. "You just stole my heart." The words looped in her mind, not a romantic echo, but a threat. Morning arrived with a cruel grey light filtering through her cheap vinyl blinds. Rose dragged herself out of bed at 9. She had a mountain of laundry and a shift at a coffee shop that started at noon. A sharp, authoritative knock at her apartment door froze her halfway to the bathroom. It wasn't the tentative tap of her neighbour asking to borrow milk. It wasn't the heavy, impatient pounding of her landlord demanding the rent she was 3 days late on. It was 2 sharp, precise raps. Rose swallowed the dry lump in her throat. She crept to the door, the old floorboards groaning under her socks. She pressed her eye to the scratched brass peephole. A man stood in the dim hallway. He wasn't Victor. He was built like a cinder block, wearing a nondescript navy jacket and an earpiece. He held a large, insulated thermal bag and a thick, cream-coloured envelope. She didn't want to open it. Her instincts screamed to lock the deadbolt and hide in the bathroom. But this was a man who worked for Victor Hayes. Ignoring him wouldn't make him go away. It would just necessitate a louder, more destructive entry. Rose unlatched the chain. She opened the door 3 inches. "What?" she croaked, her voice thick with sleep and dread. "Miss Rose," the man said. His voice was gravelly, strictly business. He didn't try to push the door open. He simply held out the thermal bag and the envelope. "Mr. Hayes sends his regards for your hospitality last night." She stared at the items. "I don't want it." "I am instructed not to return with these items," the man replied smoothly, dropping the bag and the envelope directly at her feet on the ratty welcome mat. "Have a pleasant day." He turned and walked down the hall, his heavy boots making no sound on the threadbare carpet. Rose stood in the doorway for a long minute. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old dust. Slowly, mechanically, she reached down and pulled the items inside. She locked the door. She threw the deadbolt. She slid the chain back into place. She took the delivery to a tiny Formica kitchen table. The thermal bag was heavy. Unzipping it, a cloud of rich, savory steam hit her face. Inside was a large, heavy ceramic bowl, sealed tightly with a silicone lid. It was seollyeongtang, Korean oxbone soup. Real, authentic seollyeongtang, the broth a milky, opaque white, brimming with brisket and scallions. It smelled incredible. It smelled exactly like the tiny corner shop she used to frequent in Busan when she was freezing and homesick. Next to the soup was the cream envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive. Rose ripped it open, her hands shaking so badly she tore the corner of the document inside. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't a threat. It was a bank receipt. Rose stared at the numbers printed in stark black ink. It was a receipt for a wire transfer. The exact amount of her remaining federal student loans, $34,212, paid in full, at 6 a.m. that morning. The air rushed out of her lungs in a violent, panicked gasp. This wasn't a gift. It was a demonstration. In the span of 8 hours, Victor Hayes had found her full name, pulled her social security number, tracked her debt, bypassed federal banking security protocols, and paid off her loans. He had dissected her entire life while she was tossing and turning in bed. He had reached into the absolute center of her financial ruin and erased it with the stroke of a pen. He was showing her that she had no walls. He could touch any part of her life, at any time, without her permission. Rose pushed the bowl of soup away. Suddenly, she felt violently nauseous. The rich smell of the broth was suffocating. She grabbed her phone from the counter. There was a phone number written on the back of the envelope in elegant, sharp cursive. No name, just a local area code. Laundromats always smelled like synthetic lavender and damp resignation. Rose sat on a cracked plastic chair, watching her black work slacks tumble in a dryer that rattled like a dying engine. It was 11 a.m. She had skipped her coffee shop shift. She couldn't pour lattes and pretend the world hadn't tilted completely off its axis. The bell above the glass door chimed, a cheerful, tinny sound that violently mismatched the atmosphere. Rose didn't look up, but the hairs on her arms stood at attention. The ambient noise of the laundromat, the sloshing of water, the low hum of the dryers, the distant siren outside, seemed to mute. The sharp, clean scent of vetiver cut entirely through the cheap bleach and fabric softener. She watched a pair of polished, handcrafted Italian leather shoes stop exactly 3 feet from her scuffed white sneakers. "You didn't eat the soup." Victor Hayes's voice was a low, resonant hum against the mechanical noise of the room. Rose slowly lifted her head. He looked entirely out of place, a wolf standing in a fluorescent-lit cage. He wore a dark navy trench coat over a tailored suit, his hands tucked casually into his pockets. He didn't look menacing in a theatrical way. He looked relaxed. That was what terrified her the most. He looked completely comfortable, invading her mundane, gritty reality. "How did you know?" Rose asked. Her voice shook just a fraction. She hated herself for it. The driver waited. "You threw it down the garbage chute 10 minutes after he left," Victor said, his dark eyes tracking the harsh, defensive line of her shoulders. "It was imported. The chef was quite offended." Rose stood up. She was tall, but Victor still forced her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. She reached into the pocket of her thin hoodie and pulled out the cream envelope. She shoved it hard against his chest. "Take it back," she snapped. Her heart was hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against her sternum. but a hot spike of anger was finally piercing through the terror. "Cancel the wire. Reverse it. Do whatever Mafia magic you do. I don't want your money." Victor didn't move. He didn't even look at the envelope pressed against his expensive coat. He just looked at her. He studied the furious, exhausted fire in her eyes, the way her dark hair curled wildly around her face, in the humid air, the defiant jut of her chin. "I don't make mistakes, Rose, and I don't take things back," he said softly. "You hacked my life," she hissed, her voice dropping. Terrified, the old man folding towels 3 aisles over would hear. "You stole my financial records. You found my address. That is stalking. That is illegal." A faint, genuinely amused smile touched the corner of Victor's mouth. It didn't reach his eyes. "I run the Port Authority, Rose. I move $2 billion in illicit cargo every year. Do you think I care about federal privacy statutes?" Rose's breath hitched. He wasn't hiding it. He wasn't playing the legitimate businessman. He was handing her the terrifying truth on a silver platter. "Why?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "I brought your mother a bowl of broth. I spoke 3 sentences of Korean. I am a broke waitress. I have nothing you could possibly want. Why are you doing this?" Victor slowly pulled one hand from his pocket. He reached out. Rose flinched backward, her spine hitting the hot metal of the dryer behind her. Victor paused, his hand hovering in the air between them. He didn't force the contact. He just let his hand stay there, an undeniable physical boundary he was choosing not to cross. Yet. "Because you didn't look away," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that made her stomach twist into painful knots. "My mother is a difficult woman. Most people cower. Most people ignore her because it's easier. You were terrified. I saw your hands shaking against the tray. You knew exactly who I was, and you stepped forward anyway. You saw a problem, and you fixed it with absolute precision." He let his hand drop to his side. "I am surrounded by men who would slit my throat for a fraction of my territory, and sycophants who agree with every word I say. I am bored, Rose. I am so intensely bored. And then you walked up to my table." "So I'm entertainment," Rose said, bitterly, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, trying to stop the trembling in her hands. "I'm a new toy. A novelty because I can properly pronounce Halmione." "No," Victor corrected smoothly. "You are an investment." He took one step closer. The heat radiating off his body was palpable. Rose felt trapped between the scorching metal of the dryer and the suffocating gravity of the syndicate boss. "You work 60 hours a week," Victor continued, his tone shifting into something clinical, detached, and utterly horrifying. "You sleep an average of 4 hours a night. The stress of your debt was elevating your cortisol levels, degrading your immune system. You were distracted. You were breaking down. You have no right—" "I removed the obstacle," Victor interrupted, his voice hardening into steel. "I cleared the debt. Now you don't need the coffee shop. You don't need the double shifts at the restaurant. You have time. You have energy." Rose stared at him, raw disbelief warring with the sheer blinding panic flooding her veins. "Time for what?" she whispered. Victor looked down at her, his dark eyes entirely devoid of mercy. He reached out again, and this time he didn't stop. He gently, firmly tucked a stray curl behind her ear. His knuckles brushed against her warm skin. The touch was terrifyingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence she knew he was capable of. "Time to figure out what you are going to wear to dinner with me tomorrow night," Victor said softly. He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't ask for permission. He turned and walked toward the glass doors of the laundromat, his heavy coat flaring slightly around his legs. The bell chimed a cheerful, ridiculous goodbye. Rose stood completely still against the rattling dryer. The envelope with the bank receipt had fallen to the cheap linoleum floor, resting near her worn-out sneakers. She was entirely free of debt, and she had never been more caged in her entire life. She closed her eyes, the smell of cheap lavender and expensive vetiver burning entirely through her senses. She had stepped out of the frying pan. Now she was looking directly into the fire. The trap is set, and the debt is paid. But Rose isn't the type to surrender to a cage without drawing blood. Will she find a way to outsmart the city's most lethal predator, or is Victor Hayes a game she is destined to lose? The tension is only just beginning. If you loved this deep dive into raw, grounded Mafia romance, hit that like button right now. Share this story with your friends and subscribe to the channel for the intense next chapter.